First of all, I'd like to say hello to everyone and welcome to our latest instalment of our webinar series, Frontiers Conversations. My name is Zainab and I am a journal specialist at the Frontiers in Robotics and AI journal. Today we have a really exciting roundtable lined up in which we'll be exploring the success of narrow statistical artificial intelligence, as well as examining new perspectives on achieving artificial general intelligence. This talk will be moderated by Professor Sheri Markose and will include speakers Professor Karl Friston, Georg Northoff, Tony Prescott, and Emily Cross. So I'd like to remind you to ensure that you are on mute and that your camera is off, simply because we'll be recording this for YouTube. If at any point you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box and keep an eye on the chat for any important links as well. So to begin with, I'd like to give you a brief overview of our journal. Frontiers in Robotics and AI is a multidisciplinary robotics journal, which covers a range of different robotics themes, including bio-inspired robotics, humanoid robotics, and even space robotics. If you have any questions or are interested in working with us, please do get in touch. Our email is up there, roboticsandai@frontiersin.org. Also, please feel free to visit our webpage for our journal, and we'd love if you could give us a follow on Twitter to keep up to date with the latest research. Currently at the journal, we are hosting an article collection, which is linked to this talk, in which our amazing presenters will be acting as guest associate editors. If you're interested, we'd highly encourage you to submit towards the collection, as we are currently accepting submissions, so please do check out the link. We'll be accepting manuscripts and abstracts until the final deadline of April 2022. So now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Professor Sheri Markose.
Hello and welcome to everybody. We are honored to have such a large audience with some great names amongst us. It is with great pleasure that I open the roundtable on a topic of phenomenal interest, on the grand success of artificial intelligence. In some specific areas, AI has already exceeded the powers of humans. We know of the successes of deep learning, artificial neural networks, in tasks of computer vision, natural language processing, machine translation, speech recognition, chatbots, and of course, playing board games like chess and Go. A long-held claim is that the development of artificial general intelligence is to emulate human intelligence, or general intelligence as it evolved in humans. Is this feasible? Must we be careful for what we wish for? We actually have a poll running on this, so watch out. Please do fill the poll on these two questions. Is this feasible? Is it desirable? To explore these themes, we have an exciting and erudite set of speakers in the round table, and this is the batting order. We will start first with Karl Friston. Karl is a world-leading theoretical neuroscientist at UCL. He's a fellow of the Royal Society and author of over 800 papers. He is the main purveyor of the most dominant model for statistical AI using the free energy principle. Karl, I had difficulty finding anybody to debate you. Tony Preston here says it's your formidable intellect. The last time I watched somebody debate you, the person ended up agreeing with you. I must hasten to add that I was also told about your legendary politeness, which I can vouch for. So we're honored to have you here, Karl. Welcome. Next, we have Georg Northoff. Georg is a professor of neuroscience and mental health at the University of Ottawa in Canada. He's actually here with us from Spain, from sunny Spain. He is one of the pioneers of self-referential brain processes, multimodal integration of self and other. He will expound on nothing for free in general AI. Georg is also a practicing psychiatric doctor. We then have Emily Cross. Emily's actually with us from Australia. Thank you, Emily, for joining us so early in the morning in Australia. She's a professor of social robotics at the University of Glasgow and Macquarie University. She works in the area of neuroscience, of motor physical social interaction and coordination in humans and robots. Emily is a trained dancer and uses this expertise in her studies of physical repertoire and interaction of humans and robots. Emily is a member of the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee. Last but not least, we have Tony Prescott. Tony is a professor of cognitive robotics at the University of Sheffield. He works in fields including embodied cognition, sense of self for intelligence and robot design, AI, agency, and ethical issues. He's a self-confessed aficionado of sci-fi, of AI. I think Tony's watched every film with AI and robots in it. His latest publication, Living Machines, a handbook of research in biomimetics and biohybrid systems, will inform some of our discussion. Welcome, Tony. So let me quickly set up the scene. Just as a word to all the audience, you can keep your questions coming in the Q&A box, and we will have also some live discussions. But to begin with, let me start with the premise, as one does when you get into Karl Friston's orbit, is to use his ideas that homeostasis and self-regulation of life's vitals to keep them in a narrow range. We do not want any surprisals there. And that is the ultimate objective of what will be called general genomic intelligence. The word genomic is of my doing to underscore the point that inheritable information in life got digitized to the genome 5 billion years ago. Or to put it more colorfully, as Sarah Murray Walker and Paul Davies have, there was an algorithmic takeover of biology. Control mechanisms for homeostasis became digital and increasingly complex in multicellular life. Central to this is the discovery by the Nobel laureate Barbara McClintock of viral software-based transposons and retrotransposons. They conduct scissor and paste and copy-paste operations. These are familiar to us from digital word processing. Where will we be without paste, copy-paste? Exactly what Barbara said, that genomic evolvability and genomic novelty will not take place unless these operations are there. In work done in laboratories like at the Salk Institute by Rusty Gage, I believe Rusty is here with us, they found that the transposable elements are responsible for somatic brain mosaicism and neural plasticity and real-time editing in the brain. This underscores the truism that only software can change software. However, transposable elements also present malign activity from the get-go. General intelligence has had to contend with this digital game with viral software. And 45% of our genome is made up of transposable elements. And as one would imagine, with general intelligence, 98% involves gene regulatory networks. So achieving homeostasis in multicellular life is no mean feat. It relies, as I would emphasize, on the building block of the self and self-reference. And when did this happen? So Zainab, if you can pull up the slide. So what happens is that about 500 million years ago, if you look at the top panel, with the Big Bang of immunology, what happened was there was a major shift in the way in which homeostasis was conducted. Almost 85% of all genes that are expressed that are responsible for our somatic morphology got mapped onto a virtual platform like the MHC1 receptors to record what's called the thymic self. I think Sylvia Ramon calls it that, and some famous immunologists call it the science of self. Fast forward about 150 or 120 years ago, in the human mirror neuron system, you have an exact same mapping of the self, but here the self actions, the entire motor cortex and anything that you can see and so on are mapped down onto this virtual platform. Again, going back to 500 million years ago, we were given the big tools, the big guns of recursive function with the so-called RAG operators, which is the recombination activation gene, which allows us to explore almost open-ended way, 10 to the power 20, 10 to the power 30, various changes that could be brought about to the self itself. This is in the immune system. It involves, of course, working out who the malware operations would be attacking the self codes. In the mirror neuron system, this is reused. Our self codes are reused to learn about the other. The Palmer group discovered the mirror neuron system, and Vittorio Galesi says that in under nanoseconds we can reuse our self codes to work out. If you see a friend walking, you reuse your codes and work out he's walking. So this is a huge advancement in the way in which the self was developed. Zainab, if you go to the next slide, but there's more to it about self-referential processing. This is the bread and butter of recursion function theory, and it has not been sufficiently commented on in the literature. There is more, the nature of self-referential recording will enable furthermore to achieve the homeostasis in the system by what I call a charter not to be hacked. Our self codes should be kept pristine if we have to maintain our very complex homeostasis. So in this system, what happens is that, to use a 21st century concept, it's called the blockchain distributed ledger. The purpose of that is to maintain that previous blocks are free from both internal and external malware. Given that we are beset by these transposable elements and by viruses externally, what we have here, to use a idea that I got from Randy Gillistel just a couple of weeks ago, the so-called Gödel sentence appears as being a hashing algorithm. This is like using 21st century nomenclature for something that was discovered maybe 90 years ago. And what this allows the system to do is, in having to search through the 2 to the power 20 or 2 to the power 30 various functions that could alter the self codes, there is a fixed point in which the particular attack or the particular function operates on a given code, and the code is able to self-report that it's under attack. In the absence of such hugely sophisticated methods of working out and keeping our codes pristine, we will not be here today. And this is, of course, the proof of the pudding. The proof of the pudding is that the DNA, the building blocks have remained unchanged for 5 billion years, and novel blocks can only be added that are not inconsistent with this. So this entire system runs on the principle of consistency, and consistency on the basis of the theoremhood of these self codes. So AI, if it is given all these great powers of recursion for adaptive search and for adaptability, unless it is embedded in such a PCDL, there is very little hope. It will be hacked to pieces. So at this point, I need to ask a question to Karl. Karl, you say that in the principle of free energy, you don't talk the language of biology. You do not talk about code scripts, replication, transposons, and so on. But instead use statistical data and statistical inference, which may be valid for statistical AI and its successors, but you aim to stretch it to explain all of life's forces. So does minimizing surprisals and achieving homeostasis in multicellular life need more innate formal digital structures beyond FEP?
It's an excellent question. I'd be worried if there was anything beyond FEP, in the sense that FEP is meant to account for everything, and if it doesn't, then it fails. But I think it can gracefully account for that kind of encoded, quantized, discretized kind of specification of what it is to be a good homeostatic creature. So the free energy principle is just a mathematical formulation of the way that things settle to their natural state of being. And one can read that settling to their attracting set in terms of inference, and that's the story that we usually tell. But I think the key point that you're getting at here is that that process has many, many different timescales. And much of the work which we've been preoccupied with in virtue of being neuroscientists has been on that generalized homeostasis that underwrites our behavior and our physiology in the moment. So reading that in terms of inference, I'm talking about perceptual inference or perceptual synthesis. In terms of action, this would be sort of planning as inference or active inference. but that's only part of the story. That's a very, very sort of fast timescale. There are much slower timescales that contextualize this process that are compliant with exactly the same principles. For example, learning, neurodevelopment, epigenetics, and of course there are very slow timescales, the evolutionary timescale. So that's the one I want to focus on. So if it's the case that you can regard the process of settling into the states that are characteristic of something, be it a species or a particular phenotype or a particular state of mind in the moment, then you can look at the process of that from an inference point of view. You can look at that optimization of phenotypes at an evolutionary timescale as a process of selection. And from the inference perspective, it becomes Bayesian model selection, selecting the models with the greatest evidence or the greatest marginal likelihood. And I think that's a useful way to look at it, because it speaks exactly to your question and to your observations. First of all, there's a selection process in play. And that's a very discrete act. It's an active thing. You are selecting one. The environment is selecting a phenotype, or evolution is selecting some set of conspecifics. The other key thing to note here is that we're talking about models. So when we have a homeostasis of models, or a homeostasis of the genetic code, then we are talking about variables that are discrete. There's only this model or that model. There's not a continuous space in which I move around to define different models. These are discrete things, as opposed to the free energy minimization that you might associate with physiological homeostasis or perception in the moment. So I think that tells you something quite profound, that the same kind of rules and things that come to mind are things like minimum message length, minimum description length, formulations of this kind of inference. The same kind of rules will be playing out at the level of the code. And everything that you were just describing fits very comfortably with that. You've got this sort of tension between exploration, exploitation, this sort of conservation of the code in the face of this ability of the code to explore itself and to replicate itself in ways that may or may not be fit for purpose. So I think what would be really interesting is now to apply the maths of the free energy, or minimization of free energy, or maximization of marginal likelihood, to that kind of specification, the epigenetic specification of the good generative models that are fit for purpose for this kind of eco niche.
Thank you, Karl. So your second question, we're both interested in novelty production, autonomous, endogenous thinking outside the box beyond what is already known, and that epitomizes human intelligence. You state that the search for novel solutions and explorative behavior is not just in accordance with free energy minimization, but is mandated by it, because, as you know, one of the critiques that are usually leveled against you is that you can live in Friston's dark room and why bother with all the complexity? And I showed you I indicated to you complexity. These are momentous events such as the RAG recombination activation genes. Whenever you need diversity or this huge access to open-ended search, you would need to have that particular gene expressed. So where does novelty and so on come, and growing complexity come in FEP?
Right. Well, novelty is the thing that gets you out of Friston's dark room. I've never heard it called Friston's dark room before. Strictly speaking, it's Chris Thornton's dark room. I hope he's listening. So, well, again, a great question. I'm going to answer that very briefly at two levels. First, in terms of just behavior and being and the way that we deal with the world, but then telling the same story at the level of the genetic code and at an evolutionary timescale. So at the level of me being, or you being, in your dark room. So the imperative to minimize free energy is just another way of saying the imperative to maximize the marginal likelihood of my exchanges with the environment. So that is also maximizing the evidence. You've mentioned surprisal. That's one way of thinking about free energy. They're all mathematically the same thing, but they have different teleological interpretations. Think about surprise. So if I want to act to minimize surprise, then I'm going to choose those actions that minimize expected surprise. Now, expected surprise mathematically is entropy or uncertainty, which means that the imperatives on the table or on offer under the free energy principle Every act I make is to minimize my uncertainty. So the first thing I do when I'm in a dark room is switch on the light to see what's there. So it's baked into, the dark room is the exact antithesis of what a free energy minimizing system would do in a dark room. So one way of reading that kind of behavior is if I choose those acts that are driven almost exclusively by the need to minimize uncertainty, what would happen if I do that? And you looked at a system that was doing that, a creature that was doing that, it would look as if it was driven by novelty, by sensation seeking, trying to find out what would happen if I do that, simply because it needs to minimize its uncertainty about the contingencies of the world. If we now take that to the level of this sort of model selection, which I'm using as a mathematical metaphor for natural selection, nature's way of doing Bayesian model selection to find the right phenotypes, then the same game is in play. You have to be able to explore different models. Literally, the environment or evolution has to have different hypotheses about what the best phenotype is for this particular eco-niche, which incidentally is being also constructed by that phenotype. So you need, again, this capacity to explore different hypotheses, to find out what would happen if I did that, just as we do as scientists, in order to minimize the expected surprise or the uncertainty. So novelty, I think, is absolutely central to what I think we're going to be talking about later, which will be things like artificial curiosity as characterizing the difference between the current wave of AI and AGI. Curiosity is just writing down. There is an imperative to respond to the affordance that is underwritten by novelty. And I guess that exactly the same thing is applicable to the mechanics you're talking about, the algorithmic mechanics and the coding mechanics, certainly at a genomic level.
Thank you, Karl. So we'll now move to Georg Northoff. So Georg, you have devoted a bulk of your scientific life on understanding the self, and I have indicated that self is the basis of life itself and advanced cognition. One of the earliest pioneering papers in self-referential mappings is yours. So why is the self-other nexus the fulcrum of cognition and social cognition?
Yeah, very good question. And I can directly refer to the nexus as well as Karl's homeostasis between environment and agent, because that nexus or the homeostasis may be just right away experienced as a sense of self. So right at the nexus between agent and environment. And there have been a lot of discussion about the sense of self in neuroscience. Next slide. Can you put in the next one? So, and it's clear that there's not just one self, but there are multiple selves. Yeah, there is almost as many selves as there are investigators. And what we initially investigated is just a mental tip of the iceberg. So that's what is called the mental self. That has been associated with cortical midline structures or as core part of the default mode network in the brain. Next slide. However, there's more to the self. We know that there are bodily illusions. We can be deceived about our body. Olaf Blanke pointed that out. And this, we did here a complex meta-analysis of all kinds of self-studies. And these involves regions like the temporal parietal junction, premotor cortex, and other regions. And again, the insula. Then, however, you also have to digest things, like you have to digest this workshop, you have to digest your recent meal. That's your interoceptive body linking to exoceptive stimuli. Next slide. And that again yields us very basic regions, subcortical regions, thalamus, and insula, and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. So these are regions where you have into-exoceptive connection. And that's very important because this into-exoceptive self creates sort of a virtual relation between the internal and the external. That's why this is a strong candidate to function basically as a correlate of the experience of what Karl called homeostasis. Next slide. So what is important, and that is very interesting for the topographic organization, that the regions of the lower layer of self, the interexoceptive, like the insular thalamus, they reconfigure, they resurface again in the regions of the proprioceptive self, the bodily self, plus additional region. And then the same in the those regions again resurface again in the mental self. So what you classically have here is what you call nestedness, spatial nestedness. Typical example, the Russian dolls. And when one of these Russian dolls becomes too big, it swallows all the other. Then one self, for instance, the mental self, becomes too big. That's the case in depression. Next slide. We can observe an analogous nestedness on the temple side, that the stronger the power in your slow waves, in the slower frequencies, the stronger your sense of self. So now you may ask, and this is why I describe here the example of a surfer. The stronger the slow waves, the better the surfing, the higher your self. This is empirically supported. Now you might say, why is all that relevant in the context of Karl and in the context of AGI? Because what is clear here, that the self has a complex spatial structure, which is nested in both spatial and temporal terms. And the degree of that nestedness, also of the agent within the environment, which Karl describes so beautifully by the free energy principle, might be our sense of self, a nexus which keeps us stable, continuous across time, and at the same time open to the environment, adaptive novelty and creativity.
Thank you, George. It was very interesting. So you say here you have a theory about nothing is for free in general intelligence. Can you tell us more about it? What I have in mind is what you call human error problem and the generalization problem of AI.
Yeah, the next slide, please. One can read this as sort of a next generation challenges of AI, and I'm actually here at a workshop on the next generation of neuroscience by the CNET organization in Spain. So next slide, please. So we are very good humans in adapting to all kinds of tasks. We can play chess, we can play Go, we can also learn car driving and all kinds of other tasks. However, we are average to medium to upper medium good, but we always have some error. So we have a human error problem. Next one, meaning we are good in various tasks, but not perfect in any task. But important, we can adapt to different contexts over time. For instance, we adapted relatively well to the changing context during the COVID. Next one. AI, in contrast, usually is particularly good in one task. Like we all know, the Go champion was beaten, chess. So there are almost a much lower number of errors, if not no errors. However, the same device cannot drive a car, let alone being adaptive to different contexts over time. And the question, next one, the question, why is that so? So this is the question where, as an AI person, I want to look towards the brain. What has the brain, a current AI, and even the deep learning networks do not have? Next one. So this is the brain has its own intrinsic time. It goes back to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the distinction between inner time and outer time. Inner time is the time of the brain. It has its own time. And that is, for instance, here illustrated by different time scales, long, short. You can measure that with the autocorrelation window, and you see again a very distinct topography of the different time scales. The cortical midline structures have very long time scales, sensory regions have shorter time scale. And that already gives you a hint towards the potential role of these time scales. Next one. So these time scales are apparently key in the matching between environment and brain, meaning there's a stochastic matching in the time scales. Karl would probably speak here of a free energy principle, and I agree with him, but I would say Karl takes a discrepancy in the time scales between the environmental context and the actual brain, even the individual brain, into account and build it in, and maybe your free energy formula will be much more individualized and hopefully, as I would say, predictive of certain mental features. You yourself speak, obviously, of deep temporal models, and I think I would say it's a deep temporal dynamics, which consists in the difference in the degree or repertoire of timescales between agent and environment.
Thank you, George. So we now move to Emily, because we want to understand another facet of AI and, to do with what does AGI look like? Most people would think it would look like in the pop culture, we have in mind the humanoid social robots. At least in pop culture, we have, the robots like Sophia, who looks like a cross between the Egyptian queen Nefertiti and the robot maker's wife, David Hanson's wife, that is. And Sophia the robot has citizenship and passport of Saudi Arabia. And a BBC journalist said that talking to Sophia is like a slightly awkward experience. Sounds like a bad date that you want to forget. So, Emily, what is a social robot?
So, Sheri, this is a great question. Social robots are machines, often imbued with artificial intelligence, that are designed to engage people on some social level. And we all, I think, have a kind of lay understanding of what a social robot might be and might look like. And I think many of our understandings come from science fiction and from Hollywood in particular. So if you look at this top row here, we're seeing lots and lots of examples of the types of social robots that you might be able to conjure to mind if someone mentions this. The problem with these, and what we're hearing about in news articles and media releases proclaiming almost daily, is that these sorts of robots might be coming for our jobs, might be coming to replace teachers in our classroom, workers in our businesses, and even lovers in our bedrooms. And these are things that we should be really, really concerned about. And this is kind of people's vision of worst case scenario embodied artificial general intelligence. And boy, it's a scary, potentially dystopian future, depending on whether you're watching, Westworld, or maybe it's a kind of nice, friendly future if you're thinking about the robots we might encounter in Wall-E. But these are all fictionalized encounters, and that's fun. That's fine. It entertains us. But the problem that we've spoken about in some of our research is that this sets people up, their expectations to be wildly off, their predictions to be wildly off for what robots they might encounter in the real world can actually do and might be capable of. So kind of picking up on some themes that both Karl and George brought up here in terms of expectations and reality. If you encounter the Amazon Astro, which is just out now, or the Pepper robot, the really adorable Miro kind of dog-like robot, or the Sophia robot, like Sheri mentioned in her introduction, very creepy and kind of, in reality, none of these robots is kind of performing all sorts of general tasks and able to help people or engage people socially beyond very narrow constraints in the current time. And that's something I think we have to be really quite aware of. And even the latest media release from Elon Musk for the Tesla bot, which is coming in theory in 2022. I don't think many people believe that this will actually be happening. What did he show in his press release? Well, it was a person in a robot suit. So I think we have this really big conflation of ideas about what people wearing robot suits or actors playing robots might be able to do, and what the real reality is right now of what social robotics can do for us in human society. So it's an exciting area of development, but AGI isn't quite imbuing these machines with the abilities that Hollywood and science fiction are having us expect they might have.
Thank you, Emily. So the problem here is that the company CICE allows you to create a virtual partner to your liking, and the chatbot was designed to seduce users with empathic conversations. So you say social robots are a deception. You say that we are willing partners in this complicity, and this can result in manipulation or worse. So why is it that we are so vulnerable to having a robot and sort of smiley face and all that sort of, we are vulnerable to that, and to in what extent is this deception okay, and when is it not?
Yeah, this is another really good question. And this kind of comes down, our propensity to anthropomorphize or to want to see human-like features in non-human things. So everyone's kind of probably seen headlines about people seeing Jesus in their toast, or faces in the cloud, or faces in the clouds, or these sorts of things. The human brain is very much hardwired to kind of seek out these social cues. And robots are designed by humans, they're built by humans, and they kind of are trying to push those buttons and have us engage with them in this social-like way. So we kind of have this this idea that these machines are kind of like us, and they engage us in this social way, and we're quite happy to anthropomorphize. And you might even think about the situation where your computer crashes 2 hours before a major work deadline after you've been working all day on something, and you think, oh, the computer's out to get me. Or maybe you have a robot vacuum cleaner and you think, oh, it's a very helpful character who wants to help me keep my house clean and tidy. I think if you spoke to anyone at length, they would know that their computer doesn't have these intentions and the robot doesn't want to be helpful. But we are quite complicit and quite willing, partners in ascribing these types of attributions to machines. So these might seem like fanciful examples in some ways, but there is quite a impressive and growing body of evidence that shows that there's many major and minor ways that we attribute human mind-like qualities to artificial agents. And this can sometimes help us, and it can sometimes hinder us in our ability to cooperate and engage with these agents. So one thing I want to kind of draw on here a little bit more is this finding that shows that people who are lonely or otherwise vulnerable are much more likely to form emotional attachments with artificial agents. So if anyone here has seen the 2013 sci-fi film Her, about a lonely, introverted, depressed individual who falls in love with an artificially intelligent virtual agent, you can see actually a pretty decent depiction of this kind of loneliness, self-isolation, kind of driving people to form more anthropomorphic relationships with their technology. And it's I think really quite compelling. So the other kind of idea that we're seeing as well is that soldiers in the battlefield who rely on bomb disposal robots, or robots to kind of go out into the field and detect IEDs in battle zones, can form quite intense emotional attachments to these robots as well. And these soldiers can become quite distraught and quite upset if these robots get destroyed in the battlefield, sometimes even holding funerals for the robots and kind of speaking of them as if they're friends. So we want to think about and perhaps be careful about understanding the extent to which we might anthropomorphize machines in more dangerous contexts. But there's lots, I think, to play and for us to understand from a human social perception and social neuroscience perspective about this propensity to ascribe these human-like traits to, again, just what's a bunch of wires, plastic and metal.
Thank you, Emily. So we move on to Tony now. So Tony, your recent work is about cooperation between humans and machines through robot telepresence, a form of human-robot hybrid, biohybrid, if you like. In Living Machines Handbook, you also discuss enhancing our faculties using AI in an embodied way, such as in chips or as in peripherals. Before we get there, I want to press you on the idea of trade-offs involved in general intelligence. In your recent review, you say that the mammalian cortex shows that all the necessary sensory and motor faculties are wired up, but get used, enhanced, or atrophied according to the complex responses of the animal with its environment and other factors. So with humans, we shut down night vision, say, dial down our sense of smell. Is this to give way, amongst other things, for our enormous cognitive processing so that we have capacity for tool use and extended phenotypes?
Yeah, good afternoon, Sheri. It's definitely true that there are constraints on what we can do with our brains. So the TINS article you mentioned with Leah Krubitzer builds on her research looking across the cortex of many different mammalian species. And one of the ones that we highlight there is the blind mole rat, an animal that lives entirely in the dark and relies on the sense of touch and the sense of smell to get around. But even in that animal, which has no visual input during its lifetime, it still has a visual cortex, albeit one that's really shrunk in size. It's tiny compared to the somatosensory area, for example. And that shows you one of the constraints on adaptivity of the brain, which also affects our brains. Our brain is a mammalian brain in almost every way when you look at it, and increasingly people are recognizing how similar it is to other brains rather than emphasizing the differences. So I think that that's the first thing to point out. Perhaps what we have evolved to do is to emphasize plasticity during our lifetimes. So we've traded being born as very competent individuals for being born as fairly helpless individuals, but ones that during infancy and childhood can absorb a lot from an environment and adapt to it. So we are excellent at adapting to culture, and therefore can take advantage of our cultural evolution. So I think one of the things that's constraining the evolution of our brains, I mean, there's many. For example, head size is a big constraint. We can't make our brains physically much bigger and still be born in the same way. But also the genes that specify our brains are involved in specifying many other processes in our bodies, including cell metabolism. So you can't have a mutation in a gene that specifies both something about the brain and something about cell metabolism without the risk of catastrophic consequences. It could be fatal. So there's a possibility of a sort of kind of genetic deadlock there, that we cannot change our brains that differently from where they are now. I think Daniel Dennett's talked about the design space for individuals in the context of thinking about evolution. And our brains are certainly exploring one area of design space, and possibly a small one. Murray Shanahan's talked about the broader design space for intelligent artifacts and AIs, which is potentially much larger than that's been explored by biology to date.
Thank you, Tony. So the second question is about neurorobotics. It follows principles of brain information processing, which are very different to the old-fashioned mechanical robots. Biomimetics, based on the understanding of the system architecture of the brain, suggests a layered architecture that computes multiple solutions to the same problem. So how is this influencing the design of robots?
Yeah, so I think the layering of the brain is really important, and it's perhaps not as much of a focus of neuroscience as it ought to be. I mean, if we look at the vertebrate brain, the mammalian brain, then there are layered systems, roughly equivalent to sort of the hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. And they all solve the same problems. They all deal with the same kinds of inputs, but in different ways. And this provides adaptivity and robustness. So the lower level systems, such as the spinal cord and the hindbrain, provide fast reactive control. It's largely hardwired. And then as you go up the brain hierarchy, you get more plastic systems, particularly in cortex, but they are slower to respond. And of course, it takes time to learn. So you have all of that development period in which you train up these systems, during which you have to invest in parental care. So at the computational level, there are lots of different things going on here. And there are multiple learning systems. So for example, you have the basal ganglia, which is a kind of reinforcement learning system, the cerebellum, which is a form of adaptive filter evolved in fine-tuning and control. So my slight worry about the current strong interest in predictive processing is that if we're thinking of the brain as doing predicting processes and generative models, then we can lose sight of some of these really important differences between the different sorts of learning mechanisms that we find in brains. So these sort of generative models, I think, are excellent for thinking about cortex, but we have to be aware that these are operating through these lower level systems in the midbrain and in the brainstem, which allow them to operate on these different timescales in such a flexible way. So I think coming back to robots and control engineering, John Doyle has suggested this important constraint that a lot of technologies have a kind of bow tie architecture. So for example, mobile phones just have two operating systems, iOS and Android, and everybody who has a phone here probably has that operating system. But that allows a vast array of different phone manufacturers, and also you can run many different apps. And then the brain also seems to have this hourglass or bow tie architecture, which is central systems like the basal ganglia, the reticular formation, Sometimes it's been called the centrencephalic dimension of brain organization. And that provides a funnel and a constraint. John Doyle says it's a constraint that deconstrains, because it allows areas like the cortex to change and adapt much more flexibly. So I think that's interesting to look at. Well, which bits of this architecture are fixed and can't change? And of course, in evolution, once things are set in place, it becomes much harder to change them, especially if they happen earlier during development.
Thank you, thank you. So we have now our final round of questions, which addresses the main issues that I opened up with. Karl, what do you think stands in the way of artificial general intelligence? Are there shortcomings of the existing machine learning and statistical AI? Will AGI need a paradigm shift, or is it just more of the same, except larger, let's say, trillion parameter ANNs, or better reward and punishment systems that can deliver AGI? I mean, there are some people who say that, the brain isn't a reward and punishment system. I mean, is it just a matter of tweaking the objective function to give us AGI, or is there more to it than that?
I think there's probably more to it, or perhaps less to it than that. So I think going for trillions of parameters and having augmented better reward functions is exactly the wrong way to go. And I think exactly the right way to go, if you want AGI, is to basically what Emily was describing, which is social robots. I mean, if we operationally define generalized intelligence as the kind of thing which we are so proficient at, then that operationally means that an AGI robotics would be basically creating social robots that actually care about you and are curious about you and ask you questions simply because they want you to be empathetic with them, as well as them being empathetic with you. But to do that, you have to build in curiosity into the objective function. So we actually come back to the answer that we were discussing in relation to novelty. The imperative to be curious creatures, which has got nothing to do with reward and punishment. It's all about reducing uncertainty in information gain. And I think until machine learning takes that on board, and I think they are in some corners of machine learning, then we're going to be stuck with this sort of second generation of AI. When people start to build curious machines that really want to know about you and want to be like you, then I think we'll have true generalized artificial intelligence. Technically, the marginal likelihood, free energy, whatever you want to call it, can be decomposed into accuracy and complexity. So you want to minimize complexity whilst maximizing accuracy. The expected mixture of the two is exactly the uncertainty that we're talking about, which means that when you're building artifacts that play out at different timescales that have this curiosity, they have to be minimally complex, which is why I'm saying a trillion parameters is exactly the wrong direction. You need to simplify in the right kind of way, exactly like your codes before. Trying out this, no, that's redundant. Let's keep it simple. So what we will see, I would imagine, if AGI is something that will emerge as part of our, as Tony was saying, our sort of our encultured evolution, I would imagine that the kind of robots we'll see are actually things that can run on a battery, using the jargon of edge computing, but in a way that they do actually, they are like little pets. They are like things that are curious about you, basically. That would be my position.
So George, are the challenges of AGI simply one of multimodal sensory and motor integration, so that a robot can walk and chew gum, or does it go deeper than that? And will we ever get to AGI? Is it even desirable as it involves adaptive agents who can defy us, and as you know, I'm very worried about being hacked. So, good robots, even if they have the axiom says harm no humans, I remember, do not harm humans. The not can be just hacked out and they can harm you. So what is your take on this?
I do not think that it's just a sensory motor problem. It is much deeper than that. It's not just simple input processing. It's a stochastic matching, what is shown here on the right, between the timescales. of the agent and the environment. And Karl was speaking of a dark room. And Karl told us he wants to switch on the light. If he doesn't have the shorter time scales and the fast frequencies, he cannot turn on the light. So it remains dark for him. And that's exactly what happens in disorders of consciousness. When you lose consciousness, your longer time scales completely take over. You don't have faster time scales anymore. And that means everything is integrated into one big dark soup, and you cannot differentiate anymore in your perception, meaning you lose consciousness. This has huge implications philosophically and AGI-wise. Philosophically, it's always the example of what is it like to be a bat, by Thomas Nagel. And here, maybe the bat processes ultrasonar waves, which humans can't do, meaning the bat is stochastically matched in a very different way with different segments of the environmental timescales than us as humans. That's why we cannot perceive ultrasonar waves. The bat can. So here, you tell the clear relevance of these timescales together with my dark room example for consciousness. So I hope, Karl, you have plenty of fast timescales, and I know you have because you're so fast and your light is very bright. Last thing, for AGI, next click, this has huge implications. So imagine, next slide. Yeah, perfect. No, just leave it. Here now you see I created an artificial brain. So meaning the repertoire of timescales of this brain might be much higher than the timescales of our human brain. Yeah, so we can, and that is currently lacking in the artificial agents, that they have different timescales. Meaning, for instance, we listen to music. Music is a complex of different timescales: slow, fast, intermediate, and so forth. Now, imagine if you build only a slow timescale into your agent, the agent will dance and perceive the music as way too slow because the agent has only slow timescale. Now, the reverse. You build in the agent only fast timescales, and you have a mismatch with the music's slow timescales, meaning the agent will dance and perceives the music as too fast. These extremes seem to happen in psychiatric disorders where you have a mismatch between the inner time of the brain timescales and the outer time. But what it means, if we want to develop the IGA, in particular make it more social in the direction of Emily, I think we need to very carefully titrate the timescales for the exact purpose we want the robot to have, and that these timescales may in part overlap with the humans and may in part extend the human timescales in exactly for that function we want the agent to function.
So Emily, coming to you, you say that the big threats from AI are not from stunts like Sophia or cute humanoid robots. I mean, Karl's cute and little bots, but from brain hacking, from advanced brain scanning techniques, from brain chip implants. You use this fairly, frightening concept of that we can be denuded of mental privacy. So the autonomy of self and the charter not to be hacked, which I believe is at the heart of evolution of genomic intelligence itself, which I gave in my overview, this can be threatened in ways that were not possible in the past. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. Not only not possible in the past, but not, even envisioned in the past. So we're seeing technologies such as social robots, self-driving cars, and brain-machine interfaces. All of these things are a step towards the future that a growing number of tech companies and individuals, we're talking about our friends and multi-billionaires, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, they all envision these components as entities where technology is humanity's savior. It's going to make our lives better. It's going to, solve so many of the problems we have. So there's this idea that in the future, we will work in harmony with intelligent machines. So not just these robots, but we might even merge with them. And this is where we're talking about things such as brain-computer interfaces. And I know that Tony will kind of get onto this more in the next point. So if we're going to transcend or even defy our evolutionary heritage through these technologies that are superhuman, there's actually quite a few pretty major concerns that we need to address first. So the first is that we need to ensure that this technology keeps people in mind and humans at its core, or at least these technologies are designed to thrive in a human-designed world. Secondly, I would say we have to also keep ethical concerns about privacy and not to be mentally denuded, as you say, and our right to mental integrity front and center of these developments. And if we're thinking about these tech companies and individuals fueling the race for human enhancing artificial intelligence, if we think that these companies have our backs here, we only have to look at the latest debacle with Facebook to understand that it's going to probably be profits before people, and at least profits before all of these really nuanced ethical concerns. And we really have to keep these. I think we as a public and those of us who are in a position to do so must champion for kind of making sure that these issues are addressed and not just kind of swept under the table as kind of technicality. So if we only think about the increasing availability of brain data beyond the medical contexts where brain data for years and years kind of resided in, we can easily spot some of these big challenges for ethics and human rights. So some of these risks include de-identification or re-identification of an individual, hacking, unauthorized reuse, asymmetric commodification, extraction of privacy-sensitive data, digital surveillance, trading rights for services, and criminal misuse of information, among other yet undreamed of, yet thought of risks. So kind of what I'm trying to show on this slide here, some of the examples that we have, the one that's in the bottom right corner there, this is, I'd say, an increasingly important context where we might want to closely consider the threats to human mental autonomy and mental integrity. And this is the use and manipulation of brain data in military contexts where there's a lot of funding going into this, especially in America right now. So this is the image that you see here is arguably still quite sensationalist, and it's from an American tabloid newspaper, but it doesn't take a huge leap of imagination to think about ways in which such telepathic communication by using kind of a few electrodes implanted in the helmet could be used for combative as well as collaborative purposes. It's very much the case right now that our laws of war that are applicable during armed conflict do not explicitly protect combatants against the violation of their kind of brain privacy and their mental integrity. And for this reason, again, I'd like to stress that it'll be imperative for us as humanity to think carefully and critically about how we might regulate the use of such AI-fueled technologies, similar to the ways that we're trying to put limits around the use of autonomous weapons. We want to be able to protect combatants and soldiers in the battlefield against offensive use and misuse, both during wartime and peacetime. And again, I think thinking about these sorts of things will be imperative if we want to prevent the weaponization and really dangerous developments in neurotechnologies and brain data.
Thank you so much, Emily. So this brings us to Tony, who would cover further these aspects about biohybrids, neural prosthetics, AI embodied inserts and peripherals. Antonia, you know that film with Mel Gibson in it about what women want. The character of Mel Gibson can read the thoughts of women, and of course most of them think he's a schmuck. But there is a problem here, isn't there? I mean, this trend of biohybrid humans can lead to technological singularity, somewhat different, in my opinion, to the one that, let's say, Nick Bostrom has in mind about, the paperclip apocalypse of these robots who smelt down all the metal. So why is it that enhancing ourselves to such an extent could itself lead to sort of a singularity in its own right?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Mel Gibson movie. I don't think that men reading women's minds is necessarily on the cards, but I do think some of these sort of cognitive enhancement technologies can happen. A favorite movie of mine actually is Ghost in the Shell. The original Japanese version I would recommend rather than the Hollywood one, which is about the ability to do things like mind hacking, implanting memories and copying memories and so on. And sort of, it also looks at some of the trade-offs in terms of augmenting the human, with different kinds of sensing capabilities. And there are clear costs. But I think one of the things we need to remember is we're talking about worrying about the human, but there isn't a fixed human. Humans have always changed with their technologies and with their culture. And we don't want to preserve one particular human, one sort of, if you like, 20th century human that perhaps we've lived with. But that was different from the 18th century human, and the 21st and 22nd century humans are going to be different too. And it's not for us to say what they should be like. So I think we need to be careful about these ideas of the human and holding on to something which may need to go into the past. So I think one of the amazing things about the brain, and I made the point earlier, is its ability to learn and adapt to its environment and culture. And one of the things that we've been exploring is robot telepresence, your ability to immerse yourself in a robot and have the experience of the robot. It was, sort of dramatized in the film Surrogates in a very dystopian way. But I think it's one of the realities of the world to come, that we will increasingly live in these virtual worlds and perhaps inhabit these remote robotic bodies. And that might be of great help to people, for example, that have physical disabilities. And in terms of the kind of AI moment that you're thinking about, which is the more of biohybrid one, where I think human intelligence piggybacks on the advances we make in AI. And I do think that worries about AI singularity do tend to ignore this capability of people to piggyback on the AIs that we're developing. You could say we have runaway AI intelligence, but also we have runaway human intelligence. And as Andy Clark wrote, we've always piggybacked on these technologies. So it's nothing new. And I think human intelligence will always add something to the AI and the robot to give it that extra edge. So if there is a worry, it's that AI will improve itself in a sneaky way and in a covert way. Daniel Wilson explored this in a novel called Robopocalypse. So if that were to happen, and it is a little slight worry, then I think AI could get out of hand. But with things like Nick Bostrom's paperclip argument, I do think these are sort of slippery slope arguments, and so many things have to happen for these outcomes to come about that they become extremely low probability. Even though they're existential risks, they might be low enough probability that we don't have to worry about them just yet. And I think what Emily was saying about some of the real and present day threats from AI are things that we should take seriously, are threats to our privacy, for example, from these big corporations. So although we should have a mind on AI superintelligence and the potential also for human enhancement through augmentation, we also need to think about how these AI systems are already changing the nature of the human, and to think whether these are changes that we want and are generally good for our species, or are there risks that we become lessened by them.
Thank you very much, Tony. I think we've made very good time with regard to our roundtable, the main event. Now we throw it open to the audience, but first, Zainab, do we have our discussants, those who want to sort of put their hands up and they can reveal themselves and ask their questions directly or their comments? And then I would read answers from questions from the Q&A chat box and from the chat box itself, as far as time will take us. Do we have our panelists, Zainab?
I'm just adding them.
Okay, while that's happening, let me take some questions from the chat box then. So there's a question here to Emily here. Given the trend that more and more people are aging and living a solitary lifestyle, there will be more and more social robots, especially for education, romance, communication, domestic and health support, Emily. So that seems inevitable, isn't it?
Yeah, I do think it's inevitable, and I think again, there's lots of potential for these developments to help people in big ways. I just think we also need to kind of keep humans and human ethical concerns, human privacy concerns, but also, our understanding of human social functioning and our wants, desires, and needs front and center, and not just kind of having the technology do shiny, whizzy things that don't really kind of liaise and line up and help people in these social contexts. But I think this observation is spot on. We're going to be seeing more and more of these technologies, and this has really been accelerated by the COVID pandemic as well.
Thank you. Paul Verschure, can you make yourself visible? Do you want to ask your question directly? Is it possible?
I do see myself, so I guess I'm visible.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, self-reference there.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, there are a number of questions, but in some sense, we also talk a lot around the topic now of AGI. So the question is, how do we get there, right? So, for instance, why do we still not have a free energy based AGI? Why not? Why doesn't that exist? After, Karl, how long are you talking about it? 25 years, 20 years? So why doesn't it exist? What are we missing?
Karl, do you want to take Paul on?
I never want to take Paul on. So this is one of the examples where I end up agreeing with the discussant, I suppose, the other way around. First of all, I think that the sort of free energy formalism is not 25 years old. You know, it's probably just entered into the sphere of discussion in this field in the past few years. Having said that, I think some of the imperatives have been around for a long time. Certainly things like sort of the epistemic formalism. But it's an interesting question. First of all, why would you want AGI? And I can imagine an answer along the lines, well, AGI may be just part of this cultural evolution that Tony was talking about. It may actually define the 21st century and the 22nd century human. It is a human who has created, constructed a cultural eco-niche that has artifacts that are physically separable from the human body. And we call those AGI. But you might want to ask yourself, why do you want AGI? Is it here already? From the point of view of the free energy principle, absolutely. I think Sheri was mentioning viral software, computer viruses. These are physical bits of code that hold the sufficient statistics of the contingencies and the laws of their particular eco-niche. And they self-replicate, and they are there, and they are a presence, and we deal with them. To get from a virus to a caretaker via a cute cat, that may take a few years, but free energy systems are here now. In our technology.
Yeah, but wait, Karl, let me correct you. I was in Zurich in 1990, no, 2000s, let's say, something like this, and you gave a talk on free energy. So at least I've been exposed to it for quite a while, right? And you are sitting here, in some sense, as presenting the theory that would make a non-trivial contribution to realizing AGI or intelligence, however you want to call it. And I don't believe it will. And that's why I posed a very concrete, why doesn't that machine exist yet? And that must tell us something very fundamental also about the limitations of the free energy idea. It's apparently still missing something, because otherwise some engineers would already have built it, and it's just not there. And this is, I think, worth investigating. This doesn't invalidate the concept, but it poses questions about its completeness, if you want, with respect to the challenge of building an intelligent artifact.
I mean, I think the free energy principle. It's a principle. This idea that we want to achieve homeostasis by the sounds of it. So it's more. It's like a principle of consistency, right? That in itself will not create the intelligence. I mean, this is the shock coming here. We're saying systems.
I didn't know Karl brought his lawyer, but I'm happy to see that.
No. Actually, I came into oppose Karl. You know what happens when you're trying to oppose Karl, you end up agreeing with him. But John, do you want to come with your question or comment?
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing from some of the panelists some thoughts about what has become in the current context of research of the old distinction from 20 years ago between AI and AL. I mean, there was a notion, right, for some time that leaping straight into trying to produce an AGI model of a human seems to be an unpromising pathway compared to trying to, in some sense, follow in natural selection's footsteps by initially trying to model less complex brains, but not just their brains, model less complex organisms in their full ecological connectivity, and to work up the phylogenetic scale, as it were, by that approach. I'm not. That was a very live debate 20 years ago, and I didn't hear any real trace of it this afternoon. All the discussion was about simulating humans directly.
Yeah, can I respond to that, Sheri?
Yes, please.
I agree very much with Don's comment that, and I think it's not just AI that sort of lost track of that evolutionary trajectory and understanding it. It's also neuroscience, because neuroscience obsesses about the human brain and the human cortex in particular, and really spends very little time looking at the nervous systems of other animals by comparison, or trying to understand how we got to the human brain. So the work that really inspires me from neuroscience is the EVO-DEVO, the evolution to development approach. And that, in artificial terms, translates into artificial life. And understanding these principles of evolution and development. So it's not just the evolutionary mechanisms you have to think about, it's the adaptive, generative mechanisms that happen during biological development that give rise to complex life. And the field of A-life has been really important in terms of exploring those. But I think in all of these areas, including the highly popular machine learning, nobody's building open-ended systems that can self-improve. So there's a ceiling on all of these systems in how far they can improve, and that includes the evolutionary algorithms in A-life. And so the dream that AI will suddenly get the right tool set and will be able to self-improve indefinitely at increasingly accelerating speeds, there's no real evidence for that. And self-improving AIs, it might be more like science, doing science. So human beings do science in a very slow and quite incremental way, with these occasional flashes of brilliance where we make another leap forward. But then we spend decades building and understanding that insight. And that might be what it might be like for AI. There might not be any shortcuts in having massive server farms and deep learning algorithms. It might still take a very long time and be little steps.
Thank you, Tony. Karl, quick answer.
I just want to quickly endorse that view, just from a technical point of view. Coming back to your first question and the importance of Bayesian model selection, and in some situations or some fields, it's called structure learning. That's the big outstanding problem. And I think if you look at the evolution, either in artificial life or in theoretical biology, it is a statement that the structure learning problem is really, really difficult. And it's difficult precisely because of all the space of different structures you could consider in building a human from a virus. You don't know how to build and even enumerate that space. So it's going to be an incremental process that looks very much like an evolutionary process. So I just wanted to endorse the points that Tony and Don have just made that almost fall out of exactly the same problem we started out at the beginning. What are the principled ways to explore a space of structures and configurations and relationships, which is uncountably large?
George.
Yeah, I think I hit the same tune. And what is really important, that brain, the topography and the timescales are strongly shaped by the demands of the respective environment. And we have all the timescales our predecessors are somewhat nested in us, including the respective environmental context over, 30, 40 million years. So the only way would be basically to simulate the evolution and to create such a device. And I think that's the strongly shaping constitution of the brain's structure, topography, dynamic by the environmental dynamic and context and all these different layers of evolution. Yeah, that's why we cannot just simply recreate, I would say, a free energy AI device.
I mean, of course, we've all avoided the C word, consciousness. I mean, I don't think without consciousness, this is a problem, of course, with anything to do with humanoid robots and everything else, the sense of self suddenly became sentient. without that, I don't think we're going anywhere. I mean, so my book, AGI, I mean, it'll never ever, that's the ambition of emulating ourselves. I doubt whether it'll ever be achieved in that sense. Emily, do you want to add to anything, or we'll go to Antonia? Antonia, can we have your comments, please?
Yeah, I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and one slightly different question, I guess, but I'd like to ask the panelists what they think is, do you think something that has artificial general intelligence has to be embodied in a body that maybe looks vaguely like a human, that is an active robot that can move through the world, or could you get a general intelligence in a system that's more like HAL, when we take an example from the movies, that is purely a computer sitting in a box with a voice?
If I can jump in here first, I think it's a great question, and I think from my viewpoint, it's going to be easier in many ways to have the disembodied, AGI. I think embodiment poses so many challenges, and it's also really, really important. So I think these could be kind of building blocks or stepping stones. So we if we're going to have anything that even comes close to resembling AGI, having it in some sort of disembodied, conversational or other sort of manifestation, I think is much more likely. But the challenges of embodiment, and I know, Tony and others are, deep into this. They're huge, and they're not trivial, and I think they're super, super important for us as social beings and our understanding of our world. Embodiment is a big part of it, and yeah, that's going to be a big one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Antonia. I would sort of echo Emily's point. I think we haven't talked about symbol grounding, but most of the AIs we build now don't have symbol grounding. They're just manipulating data, and they have no idea that data relates to anything else. And that is the opposite from animals, including humans. Any data manipulation happens inside our brains. It's very specific. It's about things that are happening in the environment we're in, and the actions that we might want to do in that environment. So the operations in our brains are grounded in a way that operations in existing AI systems, with the possible exceptions of ones that are controlling physical plant like robots, and there those systems are grounded. Whether you could build an AI which was distributed, so it maybe doesn't have any physical body, but is grounded through sensors and actuators that could be all over the place. I think that's a really interesting possibility. Again, if you go back to the Japanese movie, The Ghost in the Shell, that's kind of what happens, is that what was originally a human intelligence becomes part of the internet and makes the internet conscious. So I think, and I think that's also my answer, Sheri, to what consciousness is. It's the grounding of the processing in your brain, in your experience in the world. And so I don't think it's that unlikely that we'll have conscious artifacts, because once they have the right kind of grounding, then they will have meaning in their computations as much as we do. And I think that will probably give them some experience of it being something that it's like to be something that George was mentioning, which I think is the only really interesting question of consciousness that cannot be currently explained algorithmically.
Thank you, Tony. I think we now have to start taking questions from the box. I'll just read as many as we can, given the time, and then see where it takes us. So the first one is from Mario. He says, I'm a computational neuroscientist, particularly interested in mapping between biology to neural computation. So actually, since all of you can actually see the questions yourselves, shall we, so I wouldn't know who
I'm happy to step in.
Yeah, George, why don't you take this first one? It's about homeostatic adaptive dynamics, somewhat required. Is that required by AGI?
Yeah, so I would definitely say yes, your 1 second of cognitive function requires at least a 5-second answer, meaning your 1 second cognitive function must be embedded in a longer time scale, longer window, slow frequency. And indeed, there's a lot of support for that, that your external input has to interact with the inner time of the brain in order to attribute consciousness to that input. Yeah, and why consciousness, I just relate to the previous question, also what Tony said, you need this point of view. You need this anchoring in the environment, a virtual anchoring in the environment, a point of view. Thomas Nagel, what is it like to be a bat? It's a different point of view than humans. And that's why this 1 second needs to be embedded into a whole array of different spaces and timescales in order to be processed and attribute consciousness.
So I've actually lost the questions.
There's a question there from Johanna we haven't looked at yet. It's actually a question to Emily. Emily, can you see that? Why has the philosophical work on robot ethics had more impact? It's the question.
Yeah, I think this is, I did see this question. For some reason it's not showing up now, but I think it's a really, really good question, Johanna. And I think there's kind of a bunch of new areas and new disciplines. They're not new disciplines, but we're getting ever richer disciplinary input to the kind of ethical challenges of AI and robots, and what's going to happen as they take kind of closer roles alongside humanity. I know that there are several institutions and institutes that are really making headway here, and what can be done about this? I think that we can all try to get out of our disciplinary silos. This is something we hear a lot about, but it's difficult to do. But I think I am seeing progress. I am seeing hope, and I think you attending things like this and knocking on, we as whatever we're researching, kind of trying to build those bridges across other disciplines to say, hang on, we actually have something really important to say about this. I think you should listen. That's a way to start, but I completely agree that there's not been enough kind of crosstalk between the disciplines, especially from philosophy and concerning ethical concerns as well.
Right, so I'm going to take this question from Anjali Bhatt. It says, question for the whole panel. If social imperatives are indeed key to AGI, do you think we are learning by studying AGI might also inform our understanding of humans who lack empathy, curiosity? So this is the reverse causality. Does AGI or AI help us understand humans better? Karl?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I was just quietly reflecting. That's how I got into the game, was basically, if you want to understand something, you've got to be able to build one. And I'm actually also a psychiatrist, so I got into this game trying to understand what goes wrong in schizophrenia. And the cardinal thing is broken inference, inferring things that are there when they're not there, or inferring things aren't there when they are, hallucinations and delusions versus agnosias and neglect syndromes. So I think that even the current state of the art in computational psychiatry, having in silico artificial general intelligence that is epistemic, about self-learning, about inferring, perspective taking, and whether you're like me, these have it has an enormous potential to inform the kind of false inferences that underwrite psychopathology. That's one of the great hopes of computational psychiatry, is having a formal understanding of intelligence in the sense of sort of sentient inference.
Anybody else wanting to answer the question about, the reverse causality from, what do you learn from AI about the human brain itself or ourselves?
So, I mean, this was one of the big inspirations behind the Living Machines Handbook, Sheri, that you mentioned, and the Living Machines conference series that Paul and I founded and has been running now for 12 years, is that we take the principles from biology and we use them to develop better robots, but also we go the other way and we use artificial intelligence and robotics to try and understand the human condition better. And I think, it also points to the comment that Johanna made, is that sometimes we're not making enough as scientists about the implications of our findings for improving the human condition. And I think, computational psychiatry is a great field because it's looking at how we can address human mental disorders using these ideas that we're developing in AI. And as a cognitive scientist, I'm disappointed that cognitive science hasn't had more impact on the understanding of disorders than it has. I mean, most of our treatments for disorders are still, they are medicines or they are technologies such as CBT that are really more than 50 years old. So cognitive science could help us develop new treatments for disorders, and it should, but it just hasn't been the focus.
Let me just step in. I think I agree completely with Tony and Karl. I think one of the good things about AGI that we could manipulate specific target mechanism or function and then see whether the agent behaves in a way somewhat similar to what our patients do. Yeah. So I think surrogate robots or surrogate data are highly interesting, and they can obviously not be obtained from real living human brains. I think that's a strength of that approach.
So here we have a question for Roger Moore. I note that no one has defined narrow versus general intelligence, which prompts me to ask whether Siligans, C. elegans, you know, the worm, is viewed as possessing just I don't know, ANI or AGI. And if it's the latter, should we be focusing modeling efforts on then these simpler organisms before attempting to scale up to immense complexity of human beings? I mean, people have said that the best we could get is maybe the intelligence of a 3-year-old, if that, you know. So what's the view here? Tony, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I think Roger makes a great point. And C. elegans is a very successful creature. There's probably millions more C. elegans than there are humans. So if you define success in terms of the number of individuals, they're much better at life on Earth than we are. So yeah, we do use this benchmark of human intelligence to measure all of these things. And I think that is partly because we are self-obsessed, but as scientists, we ought to look more broadly, and the targets for what we're trying to do could be defined a lot more broadly. And looking at simple adaptive creatures like worms could give us a lot of insights into building robust, reliable machines. So ultimately, one of the goals of what we're trying to do is to provide useful technologies, and smart technologies, you know, are going to be used to do jobs that humans don't do, or humans don't do very well, rather than replacing human jobs. So other animal models could be more useful for designing those sorts of technologies than the human.
There are two questions for Emily. This is to do with the ethics. You know, one of them, Tim Lehman says, how do experts like you weigh the pros and cons and the ethics of human to AI robot relationships, etc.? And the second one says, this is all about, you know, having lonely people manipulated. And the second one says, could you elaborate on the ethical aspects? This is from Luximum, especially for social robots in education, romance, communication, and so on. Do they have to toe some ethical lines of behavior?
Yeah, they clearly absolutely have to toe some ethical lines, and I think our understanding of this is ever evolving. And again, this comes back to the previous question I was addressing about kind of having more input from philosophers, ethicists, sociologists, even anthropologists. We can get so many more, we can get a much richer understanding of kind of the potentials and pitfalls if we're kind of taking a broader lens here. So there are lots of, you know, thinking about authenticity and Tim's question, and lonely individuals in many situations, and this kind of comes back to the first question you asked me, Sheri, people are kind of complicit and willing in their, you know, engagement in the fiction that this agent is, you know, kind of actually there for me socially and is actually going to help me out and cares about me and is responding to me in this emotional way, whereas it's not. So I think if we understand, and if people are giving informed consent, and emphasis on the informed here, and understand kind of what the limits are of these technologies and what they can and cannot actually do for us, this will be really helpful. But then there's going to be situations like in the second question about robots in classrooms, perhaps robots with individuals with cognitive impairments, dementia, Alzheimer's, these sorts of things. We won't necessarily have the same sort of understanding or informed consent on the table, and just understanding kind of exactly the space here and what risks we're taking. This is not a really well-developed area, and I think we need a lot more research and a lot better understanding.
I'll take two more questions. One of this is, again, a suggestion for how free energy can be used. So it says here, I think one of the reasons why engineers haven't taken free energy to build AI is that free energy is a principle that describes adaptation and changes. In other words, it's not deterministic. Thus, there is no baseline or score to evaluate the performance. Besides, the basis for machine learning is data. It's difficult to collect good data for free energy training. Is that true, Karl? You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I covered my mute button with the interesting question, which was a bit silly. So yeah, I'm just. There are a number of questions there. Do you need big data for machine learning? Yes. Do you need big data to ensure sentient behavior that we call generalized artificial intelligence? Absolutely not. I think the key question, which comes back to this importance of curiosity, is how we and any intelligent system makes such great sense of such sparse small data. So I think big data is another example of people going exactly the wrong direction if they aspire to contribute to the culture of AGI. The question is, how on earth is it that we make such good sense in terms of deciding what to do on the basis of small data? The other question, the other part of the question was about, does free energy functionals provide an operational baseline for engineers? Absolutely. So the variational free energy, and this is not the expected free energy that prescribes action. And I'd love to talk more about action because nearly all the questions have been about action in one sense or another. But just limiting my response to the question, the variational free energy we're talking about in the free energy principle is just the evidence lower bound or elbow used in deep learning, in high-end deep learning that use variational autoencoders. So it's already there in a very minimal sense in high-end deep learning. The problem is these variational autoencoders don't act. They don't choose which data to go and solicit next. They don't have any bodies. So we come back again to they don't plan their actions. And I think that's the big next step. If we get a variational autoencoder that is embodied and plans its next action, then I think we're taking the next step towards AGI.
Right, so we're almost on to our last question. I think there are two questions. Can you have AGI without consciousness, like functionality of a bottleneck of sensory processing, namely agency from a single perspective? If so, might this be due to physical constraints? The robot has to move its own body, or subtle cognitive necessities that might be more fundamental and have to do with the agent at all? I mean, George, do you want to take that? I mean, AGI without consciousness.
Depends on what you want. If you just want a function without adaptivity, you can have an agent without consciousness. But if you want a really adaptive agent with the kind of curiosity and novelty and exploring you and your social relation to the agent, then you will need consciousness. Yeah, because then you need this stochastic matching process, which I described, and you need a certain repertoire of timescales. And as I said earlier, your world becomes very dark in your perception when you lose the variety or the repertoire of your timescale. That's empirically supported. So I would say roughly the larger the repertoire, the possible repertoire of timescales, meaning also the adaptivity of the timescales to the respective context, the more likely that the robot has consciousness and the more social it will be.
Right.
I make a comment, Sheri? So
yeah.
I think most of what the brain does is below the level of consciousness. So if we're thinking about building AGI, most of what we need to build is stuff that we're not aware of ourselves. And scientists work very hard to try and understand those processes and investigate them. So there may be some sort of consciousness that is operating. I think Paul Verschure has written about it. It's operating mainly in a looking back kind of way. What can I learn from the action that I just did so that I can make a better action next time? My personal view is that once we build sufficiently complex architectures that generate the right kind of behavior and that are grounded, those architectures, which will probably be able to use language as well, will describe themselves using states or expressions which resemble the languages that we use about experience. And then, you can answer the question, are you conscious, by asking the robot, and it might say yes.
Yes, part of the duplicitous way in which robots are going to behave, right?
Well, it's duplicity or not. I mean, because it's a cultural thing. We agree we're conscious, and we could agree that robots are, but
Tony said is a very important thing, that these adaptive processes I'm speaking about, stochastic matching, are completely unconscious and we cannot become aware of that. Yeah, but they need to have the right kind of complexity to yield consciousness. Yeah, so I completely go with the 50% lower of our mind or brain or whatever you want to say. Yeah, and that's the adaptation to the environment, which we're usually not aware of.
Sorry, I think at this point we have to call it a day. All good things have to come to an end. Sorry, there are 3 more questions, but I think we have to, we are almost out of time, we're over time. So it only remains for me to congratulate and to thank our great speakers. This was a lovely afternoon, and we sort of cycled our way through consciousness, duplicitous robots, and all manner of things. And I hope, so just final question is, of course, the result of the poll. And can I have a quick round from the speakers? Did they think AGI is ever going to happen, or is it desirable? Karl, what do you think?
I don't know if it's desirable, but I certainly think it's inevitable.
Right, Tony.
I think it's inevitable unless some disaster befalls humanity due to global warming first. So.
Yeah, George.
I would say it's also inevitable, but whether it's desirable or not is also in part in our hands, that we design it and model the right way.
Emily?
I agree with George's point. I also think it's inevitable, perhaps on a different time scale than what many might be thinking, but the responsibility is ours to make sure it's responsible.
Zainab, do we have the result of the poll? Does what does the poll say? Has it not? Do we have an answer?
Yep. So for is AGI feasible, 82% say yes, and for is AGI desirable, 83% say yes.
Oh my God, this is a very optimistic group. So thank you very much. Zainab, do you want to say the final thanks on behalf of Frontiers?
Yep, I'd just like to say thank you to all of the panelists for joining us, and also everyone who attended. We really hope you enjoyed this talk, and we hope that it's spurred you on to wish to get involved in this discussion. You can do so by submitting an article or an abstract to this collection. As a reminder, we are currently accepting submissions, so please do submit by following this link, and make sure you hand in your abstracts and manuscripts by April next year.
Well, if we were following the old-fashioned way, we would all now troop out and have a glass of wine or a drink. I'm parched. Thank you again.
This simply leaves me to say thanks again, and if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Our email is up there, roboticsandai@frontiersin.org, and you can reach us by social media as well. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us.